Welcome everyone to this session of the London Policy and Strategy Network. And today we're going to talk about how we can build foresight into policy making. And I'm delighted to introduce Anne Bowers, a colleague of mine at Newham Council, who wears a variety of different hats. Including a kind of hat on the work that she's done on the foresight work, but I will let her kind of introduce herself. Just a kind of another quick kind of suggestion: if everyone could mute, just to kind of avoid any kind of background noise, that'd be great. If you do have any questions throughout, then do kind of stick them in the chat, and then at the end, then we'll be able to kind of take questions as well. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Anne. Anne, over to you.
Great. Hi, can you hear me? I'm by an open window, so if it gets noisy, tell me, but
we can hear you.
Not have to close it. So good. I can't see myself. Oh, that's because my video's off. Hold on a second. Okay, great. Hi, everybody. So my name is Anne Bowers, and as Noel said, I wear a number of different hats, and they span from work that I'm doing deeply in Newham Council around engagement with the community on COVID, through to this sort of very strategic thinking about foresight and futures, and how we as system leaders and system kind of delivery agents integrate longer term thinking into our work. And Naomi, I've seen your question about like kind of now what do we do with it all? And I very quickly glanced through the names in the chat. Celia, are you Celia? Is C. Hannon Celia? I know you. Well, I know Celia Hannon, and if that's who C. Hannon is. But if you are, hello. What I'm going to do now is really talk you through the work that School of International Futures did with Government Office of Science, kind of why we did it, and what came out, and then create time for us to kind of have a conversation. And I don't, we'll see, Noel, I'll leave it to you. Maybe we'll think about whether we go into breakout groups or we just do questions or that kind of thing. And so, yeah, that's where we will go. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is ask you by kind of, I don't know, show of hands or putting something into the chat. When somebody says foresight or futures work, what does that mean to you? Like, what does that evoke? For some people, I was talking to somebody last night who sits in central government about having this conversation today, and they're like, "Oh, don't come anywhere near me with that foresight stuff. I'm just trying to make tomorrow's decisions." Other people really, really interested in kind of the longer term thinking and the ideas of what our future might look like. So just wondering what, kind of where people's heads are and orientations are around this kind of work. So as the guy who ran the phone banking I did for the Biden election said, just light up the chat, just putting your ideas into the chat. So I don't know if people wanted to share anything that they think about around foresight and futures. Science fiction. One of the really interesting things about literature that I still remember the lecture I had at university about it, was how much literature reflects the zeitgeist of a particular time. So The Little Engine That Could, for those of you who know, it was written in the 50s in the States, when we really needed to think about kind of the revival of the engine. So Seth is saying that foresight is the future and the present is explicit. Futurity, I don't know what that means. Gavin, I take your point on terminology. My view is there's terminology and then there's what we really want to say to each other. So let's focus on that. Yeah, Andrew, I like what you're saying about taking a step back and thinking long term and making sure we take advantages of the opportunities. Okay, well, please predict. That's an interesting word, Sharif. Let's come back to predict at some point. Cool. Well, just keep putting your thoughts in there and any questions. And I'm going to go into the kind of the detail of my presentation. We just practiced this because I'm a Zoomer, not a Teamer. Okay, so just to say a little bit about School of International Futures, we are a small kind of consultancy organization working really across the globe on how you do futures thinking and how you use futures thinking to make better decisions today. And as it says on the cover, and this is quite a purposeful statement, systems are cracking and we're excited. I mean, we've all lived through the last year and a bit of some pretty intense cracking of our systems. You know, the two things that come to mind whenever you think about the last year, or whenever I think about the last year, is COVID and the Black Lives Matters movement, which are really either forcing systems to crack or demanding systems to crack, and often both at the same time. And that can be quite frightening and quite worrying and unsettling, but it also can be really exciting. Noel, just to say that I'm not looking at my Teams screen right now, so if something comes up in the chat or someone puts their hand up, can you just interrupt me, please?
No,
we know each other well enough for that. Okay. There we go. So why think about the future? Beyond the fact that sometimes you think about the future because the present is too much to think about. And in the context of futures work, there are really 4 big reasons you would want to think about the future. And they really all come down to kind of 2 things. So the first is to really think about what future you want to happen, and to coalesce, to align around that preferred future, to say, you know, our ambition as a organization, our ambition as a local area, our ambition as a state, our ambition as a community group, our ambition as an organization is for a future that looks like X. Let's not even worry about whether it's possible. This is the future that we want to happen, that we want to be manifest. And then it's really about, how do you harness your agency to make that future happen? How do you make decisions today that are in service of that future? And in doing that, that visioning, how do you surface and challenge assumptions? Back to Naomi, the thing you put in the chat of kind of what do we do with your outcomes from your work, and I think it was Sport England. But I can't see the chat, so apologies if I got that wrong. It's not from the work we've done for Go Science and from a School of International Futures orientation. We don't think about the future just for fun, okay, or just to be afraid. If anyone has seen Years and Years on BBC, we think about the future. We understand, we anticipate, we narrate, we describe future scenarios so that we can make decisions today that get us to the preferred future, and that drive us, that pull away from, that bend away from a future that we don't want. Just to remind yourself in your head, there are no future facts. So somebody put in around prediction. You can't really predict where there's no fact. You can anticipate, you can suppose, you can imagine, you can hypothesize, but in terms of really complex trends about the future, you can't predict because all that we know is the past. We don't know tomorrow. And as Kenneth Boulding said, all our knowledge is about the past, all our decisions are about the future. So that's the kind of framing of why we do work on the future and how we work with Go Science. So Go Science asked us at School of International Futures to look at how different countries have developed their foresight systems. So this was not about what are different visions of the future, what are different scenarios, what are different trends. It was, how do people do that work inside a government and then integrate that work into decision making in the policy system. Okay, so again, it wasn't about how private organizations do it, or even a national system of the private, state, third, the 4 pillars of the system. It was very much about government. And part of that was a kind of calibration exercise of how well are we doing in the UK. And part of it was around inspiration, about what might we do better. And the reason that it was the kind of unit of analysis was system, rather than say, how is the Go Science foresight team working, is that fundamentally, in order to integrate foresight into policymaking, that requires a systemic response. That isn't about a single team or a single person or a single document. So the way that we did this was we did 8 case studies for context and insight. We did a half-day workshop with people from across the world, and then we brought our own knowledge and expertise to the table. The workshop, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the process if this is something you kind of want to replicate in your own organization or system. One of the reasons I was really keen on doing the workshop is that case studies are sort of useful, but they're flat, they're two-dimensional. They sit on a piece of paper, and actually in conversation with people from these countries, from these systems, brings a lot of insight to the work that Go Science might be doing or the choices they might make. So that's how we did the project. And here's what we found. And Noel will have these slides afterwards and can send them around. And these are a summary of a long report. If you're anything like me, you'll read the slides, not the long report. So this is a summary. So first of all, there's no silver bullet. And that should be sort of reassuring, in the sense that, like, there isn't a right answer that you're currently getting wrong. I mean, equally, sorry, there seems to be a Nina. I'll let the Nina go past. Okay, that is a technical term, by the way, for an emergency service vehicle. So as I say, that should be reassuring, because you're not getting it wrong. We're not getting it wrong as a system. It's also sometimes a bit challenging when an organization wants to know, well, if I did X, Y, and Z, everything would be fine. There are ingredients and there are constituent parts, but there's no silver bullet. I've talked a bit about considering foresight as an ecosystem. What really came out from the work, and particularly from the case studies and the workshop, was that these ecosystems operate in a specific sociocultural context for the nation. Now, I'm talking at the nation as footprint. You might be thinking as the organization as footprint. That's totally fine. Your organization is operating in a particular context, which is relevant to maybe the field that your organization is in, or for a lot of local authorities and CCGs, the borough, then the region, the sub-region, then the region, and then the nation. A healthy foresight system has both really strong demand for foresight and futures work, but also ensures that there's the supply. And then finally, that it nurtures itself. I've talked a bit about the features. It's the kind of corollary to there being no silver bullet. There is a common set of features. No one place has all those features, and you need a mix of them. And then finally, the best mix depends on what's already in place and what that context is. And you can do this in phases. You can build your foresight ecosystem in phases. And you can deliver and achieve the value from foresight even as the ecosystem is building. So, in the same way that I don't know, I'm not gonna come up with a great. It's the same way that you can start eating a meal when the starter is ready, even if the main isn't cooked. You can start doing really good foresight work. You can build really good foresight work even if all the pieces of the system aren't there in place. So this is our I like to call it wedding cake picture, and this is the framework that we are now using with Go Science and with various permanent secretaries and departmental bodies and bodies in Parliament to think about what the UK, or to navigate what the UK system could and should look like. And as I said, there is a socio-cultural context that's relevant. There's then a government context. And what I mean by that is, how does your government actually work? Where does the power lie in that particular system? And to ground it in some of the spaces you're coming from, you can absolutely put local authority context or organizational context. Where is power and where is authority and leadership and expertise located in your particular context? Then the system itself, which are the pieces that come together. So the expertise, the demand, the supply, the expectation setting, etc. And then finally, some capability features about what a good system looks like and needs. And there's very little you can do about the socio-cultural context. there's not a huge amount you can do about the organizational government context unless you're the chief exec or one of the top people in the organization. There's a lot you can do about the foresight ecosystem, and actually your activity can often focus on building the capability features. I'm just going to give a few examples of players in the ecosystem. So when we talk about ecosystem in a governance context, we exclude everything from the legislature to the executive, the judiciary, the audit function, what we would call here NDPBs or arm's length bodies, NGOs, and citizens in the media are also incredibly powerful players in that ecosystem. Really citizens mediated through the media, but also shaped by, informed by, I guess molded on some level by the media. So I'm gonna jump then to the capability features, because unless people want more on the kind of, actually, let me spend a little bit of time on the context, because I've talked about the government context, but the socio-cultural context is also really important. You know, for anybody who's either has their feet or their selves or their identity in more than one nationality or kind of cultural identity, and most of us would tick multiple boxes on the census. That in some parts of yours, some of communities you're in, there is more or less comfort with, appetite for, engagement with uncertainty, for example, or engagement with what might happen long term, or engagement with kind of stargazing out and then coming back in. And then in some cultural contexts, it's very much about kind of what is here and now, and what can we, what is numerate, what is visible, what is evidenced, and therefore we can extrapolate from that. And it's not like one socio-cultural context is better or worse for foresight work or futures work. It's just that those things are relevant to how people, and then the units they're in, and the teams, the units, the departments, the organizations, and then the systems, how they think about and integrate long-term thinking into their today's decision making, and equally kind of a sense of agency about making choices that drive towards a particular prioritized or preferred future. And we took a big, you'll see, well, we won't see in the report is a big discussion on, say, education, but it was very clear that different forms of kind of education will lead to different, slightly different mindsets. And on a very practical basis, people from different disciplines often bring different mindsets into this context. So as I said, the ecosystem operates in this context, and it has 3 priority activities. You will be completely unsurprised to hear about supply and demand, right? Every ecosystem has this supply and demand relationship. How are you creating good supply that responds to demand, that in turn generates more demand, in turn requires more supply? So there's that dynamic. I think everybody in this room will be very familiar with. The bit that we're excited about and that we've added to that narrative is about curating and nurturing the system. That this supply demand doesn't just happen sort of organically, absent of any nurturing. And good, strong, robust, lasting foresight teams, units, systems in government have an explicit, conscious approach to nurturing themselves. And in the UK, in Westminster, one of the examples of that is the Heads of Horizon Scanning group that meets, I think it's quarterly, it may be every other month, to share and learn around foresight work, but also to know that there are other people across government who are thinking about the kinds of future questions that foresight teams work on. And it's also about curating and nurturing the kinds of insight, intelligence, evidence that you can bring into both the supply and the demand. And sometimes I think we heard from quite a lot of people across all the case studies, including we did an at-home UK case study, that it can be tiring sometimes to be the foresight person, because most of your colleagues, particularly in a policy environment, are trying to think about today's decisions, and that's ever more true right now when things are changing Not so much today, but 3 months ago, things were changing almost minute by minute in terms of the context that we were working in. And finally, this is the kind of, when I put my ops hat on rather than my strategy hat on, this is like the ops bucket that you would say, okay, what's the work that we can do to build our foresight ecosystem? So you can do work on processes. So how do teams writing policy engage with foresight? How do teams taking decisions engage with particular scenarios? How do you create those scenarios? In the UK, the DCDC, which is and someone else will know what DCDC stands for, but it's the thinking guys in the MOD, and they produce something called Global Strategic Trends every couple of years. That's part of the process of the foresight system in the UK, is this production of a document, a really, really well-researched, thick document around trends and where they might go. People, one of the decisions often that happens in a foresight ecosystem is whether you have a kind of champion, and whether that champion emerges organically from the existing work, and it's somebody who's, so Singapore is the very, and Malaysia are very classically kind of led by a champion that's emerged from the government and been somebody who says, you know, foresight thinking is critical, and wherever they go in their organization, they bring that ambition to their work. Structures, so things like foresight teams, foresight committees, expectation, review processes, engagement processes with policy, decision making. Those are the kinds of structures. And then culture and behavior, which is purposely at the top because it's the sort of, you need that in order for these other things to manifest into an ecosystem. That's very much around, you know, how do we think about, how do we understand the long term and then integrate that thinking into today's decisions. So here's some specifics around each of those features. I'm not gonna go into them. It's more to just say that in the slides and in the report there are indications and suggestions based on the 8 case studies and our own work and the workshop of the kinds of things that you could do in each of these different features. And so that's really kind of it. That's our framework. That's the kind of I think the insight from the work, or the bits where we've had real kind of reception to the work, are first that we've made explicit the need to consider context, and then second that we've created at the other end of the thinking, you know, we've created sort of operational buckets that you can start to think about activity and process. So I will stop sharing, and I think somebody's not on mute who might want to be. And yeah, just take any questions, comments, thoughts, etc. I'll skim through the chat really quickly as well.
Thanks.
So that's the work that we did. I guess, sorry, the one thing to say is what's happened now. So in one of those ways where you don't, you know, you never know how something's going to land when you do a kind of piece of work like that, we're really, really excited and pleased by how it's landed. So the Go Science find the framework very, very helpful, and the recommendations really useful. There's been a permanent secretary, so top of the civil service departments, meeting with the head of the civil service around what might this mean for individual departments and what might this mean for Whitehall generally. And we know that there are particular departments, Department of Education, MOD, and others, who want to make use of the framework as a kind of mechanism for building foresight capability across their organization. So that's, yeah.
Great, thanks, Anne. That was a great whistle stop tour through the work that you've done. And there's a couple of questions in the chat. One of them is around are we seeing foresight ecosystems beyond organizational boundaries, i.e. across partners, for example, that might be from different sectors, like beyond government?
Yes. So but what we so the short answer to that question is yes. In the case studies that we looked at, and I think it's primarily Norway and Sweden, but I have to go double check. we saw that in particular, and the US and Canada. They don't tend to go much further than, say, third sector or kind of think tank type bodies. So it's sort of people, if you were going to do, concentric circles out from government, it's people still in concentric circle, one or two out from the bullseye. And there's a different, this goes back to the kind of sociocultural government context. There are differing levels of comfort with using, with partnering with the private sector. So one of the big trends obviously is tech, right? And social media and the new kinds of voice and voice power and all those kinds of things that are going on. And there are different levels of comfort of sort of getting into bed, as it were, with those types of organizations to think of scenarios. And the other part, so that's the kind of answer to that piece of it. So it's often third sector bodies, often funded by government, to do work that is then integrated into the government foresight work. The other place where we're starting to see more engagement, and if Celia is here from Nesta, they're doing some work on this, is around engagement with the public directly. So like direct interaction with the public around, specifically around foresight questions, but also as weak signals and nodes of evidence around future trends and where future trends are going.
That's really interesting, and that was I guess a question I wanted to pick up, which is around. So I guess there's bringing in the public to foresight work that an organisation has initiated, be it central government or local authority or your kind of voluntary sector or kind of another sector. But I guess there's also something which is around, kind of enabling kind of people to be able to, communities to be able to kind of do foresight work in ways that work for them, where they frame the foresight. And it reminds me of, so Transition Town, they kind of do very kind of community-based foresight themselves, and they're not doing it in response to kind of the local council, but like per se, they're doing it like for their communities, and almost they're the ones hosting the space. And we see that increasingly in terms of there being good community organisations that are really good at hosting the space for thinking about like big issues in our local communities. And I wonder, like, kind of, are there any kind of other examples of kind of non-governmental organisations that are hosting the space for kind of doing the foresight, which might be different to government initiating the work itself?
So, I mean, first of all, we didn't look at that, right? Like that wasn't part of our brief. So I can't give you a deep answer from the Go Science work, because the question was, what are governments doing, not what are people doing? But from some work I've done with UKRI on their public engagement program, ScienceWise, which is helping them think about the future of that program, there are absolutely places where that's happening, where public discourse activity is focused on the future. And in fact, at SWAF, we've just done a piece of work in Wales on behalf of the National Lottery on how you support local communities to think about their future and choose actions towards a preferred future. What I would say from that Wales project, the ScienceWise work, and the work we did in the Go Science case studies on how government interacts with the public, the big question is, how do you leverage that back into policy making and decision making? So it's absolutely great and fine and lovely and wonderful for a community to get together and say, this is the future we want. This is the future we're coalesced around. This is the future that we think is right for us and our community, however defined. How you then integrate that into decision making that responds to that ambition is one of the big questions that we're starting to ask. Now, that's only relevant, that's only relevant if you need policy decisions to help manifest that future, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, work by people like 38 Degrees and I'm blanking on the one that's in red, that create petition, a place for people to organize around demands and petition and those kinds of things, starts to make that voice much more visible and much more impactful, as does Twitter memes and all those kinds of things. But yeah, there's that impact on decision making. That's, I think, it's a difficult challenge to consider.
There's a couple of questions here. Andrew, do you want to come in on your question about demands?
Yeah, thanks for that. Really, really interesting presentation, and it's something we're thinking about at the moment around how we can do this foresight stuff a bit better. So it's just about how do you create that demand, because I think there's unmet or maybe unrealized demand, sort of that people want it but they don't know that they want it. So how do we create that demand there? So if we start doing some work around it, start pulling some of this ecosystem together, and then getting that through to the right people and creating that demand.
So sorry, where did you say you were from, Andrew?
I'm from Richmond and Wandsworth Council.
Oh, that does not look like Richmond and Wandsworth.
No, it's not.
So there's multiple ways you create that demand. So there is so sometimes the and there are different balances at different times and in different systems. So in some places, that demand is sociocultural. So for example, in Dubai, in the UAE, where most of the foresight work is done in Dubai. So in Dubai, in Singapore, in Malaysia, countries where thinking about their future is sort of kind of their longevity and their stability as a nation is really dependent on thinking about like where next for us as a nation. What happens if oil dries up? How are we? What is for Singapore? What is our role as a small island in the middle of the sea kind of thing? That demand is sort of almost innate in the ambition of the nation. That's different than say, and I mean, these are generalizations. So don't, this is not a kind of hard and fast rule, but so part of it is cultural Norway. If you're an oil-based economy, you think about long term because just the nature of how you're extracting your resources is long term. Other places, it's derived through some sort of charismatic champion who is senior and a leader and sort of makes clear through their own both positional and personal authority the value of thinking long term and the value of using long term visions and scenarios in your day-to-day policy making. Other places, like I think it's Finland, have a parliamentary expectation that every couple of years, every time there's a new government, that government sets out a vision. Wales, which isn't a case study because it's in the UK and we didn't do kind of detailed UK case studies, but Wales has a Future Generations Act and a commissioner that sets legislative requirement and expectation. So that's like kind of top-down demand creation. Is it something about the nature of your nation state, something about a kind of charismatic leader, and something about requirement and expectation in systems. Then there's also demand that it's created by someone's put in the chat a question about have we shown impact? Have we found examples of impact? I mean, that's the $10 million question. We've shown examples of impact by policymakers saying, I am confident that the thing that I decided, the choices I made are more informed and more oriented towards a shared outcome because I thought about it. You can never say this futures exercise resulted in this specific policy outcome because every decision that's taken in a government is informed by so many different choices, different inputs, sorry.
Thank you very much. That's super helpful.
The other thing the other thing that we learned is, and Singapore are particularly good at articulating this, is don't try and create demand for like a massive futures project with 5 future scenarios that people then have, create appetite for thinking about the implications of decisions long term, and thinking about the implications of how they bend the kind of the journey of the journey, but don't try to create demand for everything all at once, because that's why often foresight people are seen as, those guys who are going to come in and do some thinking and then leave us alone with our like difficult policy and our complex answer. actually you can help people just literally just sense check their decisions against potential scenarios, and that creates comfort in you as a resource and a capacity and a support.
Cool. There's a couple of questions, Anne, about the kind of the Wales project. Is there more on that kind of people can access, or will that be kind of in the report that you've done?
So we have not done work on Wales. The Welsh Commissioner is required by the Act to produce a report. I think it's every year. I mean, I looked at Wales, is it 4 years or 3 years ago now, when I was doing some work for the Health Foundation, which is a big health think tank with a lot of money. They were thinking about how you get foresight thinking into the NHS at the top of the kind of health and care system. And at the time that I looked at Wales then, what was emerging was that the theory was great, and it was fantastic to have the Act, and it was fantastic to have so I don't know who knows, the Welsh Act has some outcomes that are common and then some ways of working. So it's a matrix, right? It's like what we want to do and how we want to do it, and then requires local areas to have plans against those outcomes delivered against these ways of working. And that's translation from that articulation of ambition to actually doing that work, that it was really tricky. There were definitely organizations, I remember speaking to Natural England, who were saying that simply the presence of the Act and a way of working, which was partnership working, was opening up conversations and opening up opportunity to collaborate and to talk about long-termism that hadn't been there before.
Great. And Soraya, do you want to come in on your question about cultures? Don't know if Soraya's on mute. Oh, kind of mic's not working. So I don't know if you can see it, and there's a question by Soraya around how to deal with cultures that are much more comfortable with the as is than actually to see the kind of the future possibility of the to be.
Oh, why would you ask that question in this country at this time? I've just put the Wales stuff in, a link in the Welsh stuff. I mean, I think it goes back to the question Andrew asked, and the point I'm just going to have to look, like Seth has made, about impact, showing. So first of all, don't try and change the world in one day. Be very, very ambitious in your influence on how people are thinking, but pragmatic in like where in their decision making you can intervene and you can support. But in terms of people thinking, very today, I mean, I think the last year has given us, a number of examples where if we do not think about the potential medium term, the potentials that might happen, when they happen, we are totally caught out. So a pandemic like COVID was on risk registers all across the world. And there's someone from OECD here, and I bet you've seen it across all the kind of countries. But the kind of understanding of what to do about that and how to integrate it wasn't really there. And so we now have more and more evidence of the need to do this kind of thinking. It's hard. It's hard. Like, don't think it's easy. And champions are incredibly important. Sorry, no.
No. I was going to say, when you're kind of introducing yourself, you're talking about the different hats you wear, both for kind of on a strategic and kind of like frontline level. And I know you kind of you're doing some work on how to create spaces to kind of to better listen to kind of to frontline staff, and is that a way for people who are kind of experiencing the kind of the direct impacts of the issues like within an organization to be able to feed in that into that process, kind of creating the spaces for them to kind of reflect, not even on a in terms of foresight explicitly, but just to come up for air?
So, I mean, this is what Nesta calls collective, or Jeff Morgan calls collective intelligence, right? How you bring voice and data together, and also the stuff like Kelly Chase look at around frontline voice, not just resident voice. I mean, this is a kind of a philosophical, if we're on a walk question a bit, Noel, but which is fine. I like those questions. It only works if you ask the right questions. So for for those of you who are here who are foresight practitioners, the term weak signals, right? The nodes of noise around that actually tell you that something is changing, that something is emerging. So as a very specific example, back to my very frontline work, I heard lots of questions from our community in Newham about COVID vaccine in early November, told us that was what people were interested in and we needed to start talking about. So yes, the front line is absolutely a source of that weak signal, and an often overlooked source, because we go straight to residents a lot in local authorities and in health systems, or to our bosses. But you have to ask the right questions. And my experience of trying to ask those, so we tried to ask those questions in the work I did in the Health Foundation to GPs. We tried to say to GPs, what do you think is changing? Like, what do you almost feel based on, if you're going to do 6 hours of 10-minute consultations all day, that's a huge amount of qualitative data. What do you feel? And that just was a question they couldn't yet answer, because they're, back to Andrew's point about demand, they're so used to answering what's happening today that helping people open their minds, say, what might this tell me about the next few years, is something that you have to facilitate in quite an active and conscious way. And there's a lot of evidence that someone here will probably be much more experienced than I am in like deep community engagement. But there's a lot of evidence that when you ask people what they want, they tend to stay inside what they think is possible, even unconsciously. And so finding the work that people like Superflux and Liminal Space and these other experiential design organizations do to help people surface their thoughts are the kinds of things you could do with frontline staff. I was slightly a riff, but yeah.
That's great. And I wonder, we've got a bit less than kind of 15 minutes left, and I can see there's a mix of people from different organisations. So I wonder whether we get out into into small breakouts and kind of maybe like if we reflect on kind of like kind of what we've heard from Anne and kind of like what we've discussed and kind of like kind of like what that looks like for the organisation like you're working on. Your organisation might be kind of a decision-making organisation, whether it's a government or kind of like local government, or you might be supporting other people to do foresight work. And also I suppose the kind of second question, which is what could you take away from this session in terms of what you could do in the context that you're working on, because there's always kind of like different contexts that we work in, and there's never like a one size fits all solution, but there's I think there's some principles and some ideas that kind of that Anna shared that we can kind of take away, adapt, hack, kind of test out in our organization. So suggest like we do that for like the next 10 minutes. Hopefully it's also a chance for people from different organizations to find out what you're all doing kind of on this issue, or kind of thinking about if you're not kind of doing anything anything on it, and also just a bit of kind of an opportunity to chat to other people. So I'm going to set out the breakouts now. There's probably kind of about breakouts for like 2 or 3 people, so you can have a have some opportunity to have a chat. But I think this is such an important subject, and sometimes it's a subject that organisations kind of don't get round to. So I think the report is is really interesting. I definitely encourage people to kind of to read it, and obviously to digest the kind of the slide deck as well, which kind of gives you that gives you that top level. So I'm going to start the rooms now. By the way, the breakout rooms won't be recorded, so you can chat at your kind of heart's content, and hopefully different people will go out into breakout rooms. And this main session, and I'm going to stop recording at this point,